The recording lasted 43 seconds. 43 seconds of my son's voice, low and deliberate, telling my daughter-in-law exactly how they planned to do it. The prosecutor had warned me it would be difficult to hear in a room full of strangers. She was right, but I sat in that front row with my hands folded in my lap and I listened to every word without flinching, because I had already listened to it dozens of times alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m, preparing myself for exactly this moment. "It's just a signature," Marcus said on the recording. "The notary owes me a favor. Once we have the POA filed, we liquidate the cabin account first, then the brokerage. By the time he figures out anything is wrong, we'll have enough to start over. Clean. And if he finds out before that?" My daughter-in-law's voice. "He's 67 and just had knee surgery. What's he going to do?" The courtroom was very quiet when it ended. Even the defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Greer, who had been shuffling papers with great confidence all morning, went still. My son sat at the defendant's table looking at the floor. My daughter-in-law Diane was staring at the wall behind the judge, as if she could find a door in it. The prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Chu, who had spent 20 years in the Nashville DA's office and had the economy of motion that comes from having seen everything, let the silence breathe for a moment before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "what you just heard is not a misunderstanding. It is not a family dispute about finances. It is a deliberate plan to defraud a recovering man of everything he spent a lifetime building, spoken in his own house, 3 rooms away from where he was sleeping. I had been a cardiac surgeon for 31 years. I had stood in operating rooms with someone's heart literally in my hands and kept my breathing steady. I had delivered news that broke people in half and stayed present while they broke. I knew how to hold still when everything around me was moving fast. I used that now. I held still, and I let Sandra Chu do what she was very good at, and I waited. This is how it had started. Not with the recording, not with the courtroom, but with a bowl of soup I did not finish. My wife, Carol, had passed 3 years before. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, the house in Brentwood felt like a set of rooms that had forgotten their purpose. I kept the same routines, cooked the same meals, watched the same morning news, but there was a hollowness underneath everything that I never fully adjusted to. Carol had been the warmth in the house. Without her, the square footage was just square footage. Marcus had called 2 weeks after my knee replacement. Routine procedure, outpatient, but my recovery was slower than I had hoped, and I was moving around the house on crutches, feeling sorry for myself in the particular way that men of a certain age do when their bodies remind them of their age. He said he and Diane wanted to come stay for a while, help me through the recovery, be there in case I needed anything. I said that wasn't necessary. He said he wanted to. I said, all right. I should tell you about Marcus before I continue, because he was not always the person who sat in that defendant's chair. He was a boy who wanted to learn everything. When he was 9, he used to follow me into the workshop behind our old house in Franklin and hand me tools before I asked for them, watching my hands with this absolute concentration, like he was memorizing the way things were built. I taught him the first thing my own father had taught me. Measure twice, cut once. He loved that. Repeated it to his mother at dinner, like he had invented it himself. The man who married Diane was not that boy. He was a man who had spent his 30s moving from one real estate venture to the next, always 6 months away from the deal that was going to fix everything, always needing a small loan to bridge the gap. I had given him money over the years. Not enormous amounts, but enough that I had begun to notice the pattern. The need never closed. It just changed shape. Diane was the shape it had taken most recently. She was attentive in the way that people are attentive when they are paying close attention to something other than you. She asked about my health, my plans, whether I had thought about what I wanted to do with the Smoky Mountain cabin now that Carol was gone. She asked about the cabin a great deal. Carol and I had bought that property in Gatlinburg 30 years ago, paid it off quietly over a decade, and it had appreciated in ways that would have surprised our younger selves. It was worth considerably more than it had been, and it had no mortgage, and apparently that fact had not escaped my daughter-in-law's attention. They had been in the house for 10 days when I noticed the first thing. I had left my laptop open on the kitchen table and come back to find the browser history cleared. I was not at that point alarmed. People clear browser histories for ordinary reasons. But I was, by nature and by profession, someone who noticed things and filed them. 31 years of watching vital signs for early deviations had made that instinct automatic. I filed it, and I waited. The second thing was a phone call Marcus took outside on the back porch, voice low, that ended abruptly when I opened the patio door to ask if he wanted coffee. The third thing was finding Diane in my home office one afternoon when she had told me she was taking a nap. She smiled and said she had been looking for a pen. There were pens on the kitchen counter, in the junk drawer, in the small cup on the entry table. She knew that. We both knew that. I did not confront them. I called my attorney instead. His name is Philip Garrett, and he had handled my estate planning for 15 years. I told him what I had observed and what I suspected. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Harold, if what you're describing is what I think it is, the most important thing you can do right now is not let them know you're watching." I said I understood. He told me to change the passwords on my financial accounts immediately from a device they could not access. I drove to the library the next morning while Diane was at a yoga class, and Marcus was allegedly job hunting, and I sat at a public computer and changed every password and added two-factor authentication to every account. Then I called a security company and arranged for cameras to be installed in the common areas of the house. I told Marcus and Diane I had decided to get a home security system because I had been thinking about it for a while. They both said that was a good idea. What the cameras caught over the next 3 weeks was methodical and cold, and once I understood what I was watching, not surprising at all. Marcus on his phone photographing documents from my filing cabinet. Diane at my desk, writing in a notebook I did not recognize, then hiding it in her overnight bag. The two of them in the kitchen at midnight, voices too low for the audio to catch clearly, but leaning close together over Marcus's laptop with an expression on their faces that I recognized from decades of watching people make calculations they believed no one else could see. I downloaded every recording. I kept copies in 3 places. I called Philip again and told him what the cameras had found. He arranged for a meeting with a forensic document examiner named Karen Bosley, who specializes in exactly the kind of fraud we were beginning to understand was being planned. Karen examined my signature on file and told us what to look for if a forged power of attorney document ever appeared. Then, quietly, with Philip's guidance, I transferred the Gatlinburg cabin into an irrevocable trust. I updated my will with a different attorney from Philip's office, a woman named Rosa Chen, and I asked her to keep the document in her firm's safe and tell no one, including me by phone, until I gave the word. Then I waited. I did not have to wait long. The forged power of attorney was filed 6 weeks after they arrived. A man named Dale, a notary public whose license had 2 prior complaints attached to it, had witnessed my alleged signature on a document granting Marcus full authority over my financial assets and real estate holdings. The filing was clumsy in ways that Karen Bosley would later enumerate for the jury with the patient thoroughness of someone who has explained forgery many times before, but clumsy is not the same as harmless. Without the preparations I had already made, it might have worked. Marcus's first call to the Gatlinburg County Recorder's Office, attempting to pull the deed on the cabin, came back with information he did not expect. The property was in trust. He could not touch it. I heard him on the phone that night, his voice tight, telling Diane there was a problem. I heard her say, "What kind of problem?" I heard him say, "The cabin's in a trust. I don't know when he did it. I don't know how long it's been there." And I heard her say, quietly, "What about the brokerage?" What about the brokerage was where they made their final and fatal mistake. The brokerage account had a fraud alert I had established the same week I changed my passwords. When Marcus submitted a transfer request using the forged POA, the firm flagged it immediately and called the number I had designated, which was Philip's cell phone. Philip called Detective Angela Reyes of the Metro Nashville Financial Crimes Unit, with whom he had established contact 2 weeks prior. And Detective Reyes, who had been waiting patiently with the recorded evidence already in hand, moved quickly. The arrest happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the backyard, sitting in the garden chair Carol had picked out the summer before she got sick, drinking iced tea in the September heat. I heard the doorbell, and then voices, and then Diane's voice rising, and then nothing for a while. Detective Reyes came around the side of the house and told me it was done. She had a calm, matter-of-fact face, and she looked at me for a moment with something that might have been respect before she said, "We'll need you to come in tomorrow and give a formal statement." I said, "Of course." She left. I finished my iced tea. The cardinal that lived in the oak tree by the fence was doing what it always did on warm afternoons, and the sky was that particular end-of-summer blue that doesn't last. And I sat in Carol's chair and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened and what it meant. Then I went inside and made dinner. The trial was 4 months later. Greer, the defense attorney, was competent and not without creativity. His theory was that Marcus had acted under Diane's influence, that she had manipulated a man already under financial stress and emotionally vulnerable after his mother's death, that the forged document was Diane's idea, and Marcus had been essentially a tool. He brought in a psychologist who testified about coercive control dynamics and the ways that a determined partner can erode independent judgment over time. It was a reasonable argument. It was also contradicted by 6 weeks of camera footage showing Marcus as an active, enthusiastic, and detail-oriented participant in every stage of the planning. The part of the trial that Greer had been building toward came on the 3rd day, when he called me to the stand. Philip had prepared me for this. He had said, "Harold, they're going to try to make you look like a man who set a trap because he wanted to destroy his own son. They're going to use the word calculated. They're going to ask if you love your son. Stay steady and tell the truth, because the truth is on your side." Greer started gently. "Dr. Harrison, you and your son were close when he was younger, weren't you?" "We were," I said. "And after your wife passed, Marcus wanted to come be with you, to help you, and you let him into your home." "I let them both into my home, yes. But you also installed surveillance cameras without telling them." "I installed cameras after observing behavior that concerned me, in my own home, which I was legally entitled to do." "Behavior like stress," Greer said. "Like 2 people under financial pressure, worried about the future." "Behavior like photographing documents from my private files," I said, "and meeting with a notary whose license carried 2 prior complaints, and researching power of attorney procedures on a laptop they believed I couldn't access." Greer shifted. "Dr. Harrison, isn't it true that rather than simply speaking to your son about your concerns, you instead constructed an elaborate series of traps? Changed accounts, transferred property, arranged for fraud alerts, all without once sitting down with Marcus and saying, 'Son, I'm worried, what's going on?'" I looked at him. "I have a question for you," I said. "If you suspected someone was planning to steal from you and then lie about it, would a conversation stop them?" Greer smiled. "That's not really an answer." "It's the only honest one," I said. "My son was not making a mistake, he was making a plan. Plans require evidence, not conversations." The jury actually leaned forward on that one. I noticed, because I had spent 3 decades reading rooms, reading the subtle shifts in posture and attention that tell you whether you have lost someone or whether you still have them. I still had them. Greer tried once more. "Dr. Harrison, you testified earlier that you found cameras were installed and began your own investigation before the power of attorney was ever filed. So you took all of these steps based on suspicion alone. You disrupted your son's plan before a single crime had technically been committed." Sandra Chu was on her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The forgery was committed when the document was notarized, not when it was filed." Sustained. Greer sat down. I was dismissed. On my way back to my seat, I passed the defendant's table, and Marcus looked up, and our eyes met for the first time since his arrest. His face had the hollowed-out look that I had seen in families who received news they were not prepared for, who had believed until the last moment that somehow it would not be this. I had delivered that kind of news many times. I knew there was nothing to say when someone looked like that. I kept walking. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent most of it at Philip's office, which was easier than sitting in the house where all of this had happened. Philip had a good coffee machine and a view of the Cumberland River, and he let me use the small conference room without interruption, which was the most useful thing anyone did for me during those 2 days. I read. I worked on a letter I had been putting off writing to a former resident I had mentored, who had just taken a position at Vanderbilt. I thought about Carol, who would have known exactly what to say at every stage of this, and who would have said it at the right moment, which was the particular talent I missed most about her. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, Philip's assistant knocked and said the jury had a verdict. The courtroom was fuller than it had been during testimony. The case had gathered attention, which I understood but found tiresome. My son's name in the local paper 3 times in 4 months was not something I had wanted. But there were things I had not wanted that had happened anyway, and this was a small one. The jury filed in. The forewoman was a man in his 60s, a retired teacher whose face throughout the trial had been attentive and without expression. Judge Whitfield asked him to read the verdicts. "On the charge of forgery against Marcus Harrison, how do you find?" Guilty. On the charge of fraud against Marcus Harrison, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of attempted theft over $10,000 against Marcus Harrison, how do you find? Guilty. 3 counts, 3 guilty verdicts. Marcus did not move when each one was read. He sat perfectly still, which was not how I would have expected him to respond, and for a moment I thought about the boy who used to sit perfectly still watching me work with my hands, who could hold that same focused stillness for long stretches when something had his full attention. I pushed the thought aside. Diane's charges were read next. Forgery, guilty. Conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. 2 counts. Greer immediately requested a continuance for sentencing, citing the need to prepare mitigation. Judge Whitfield denied it for Marcus but granted 2 weeks for sentencing to allow the pre-sentence investigation to be completed. He noted from the bench that the evidence of premeditation was extensive and that the relationship between the defendant and victim was a significant aggravating factor. After the proceedings, a woman in the gallery touched my arm and said she was sorry. I thanked her. Philip walked me out to the parking structure and said, "The sentencing will be straightforward. Sandra is asking for the maximum on all counts." I nodded. He paused. "Harold, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer. Do you want to submit a victim impact statement?" I thought about that for a moment. I had already written one, actually. Written it in the conference room during those 2 days of waiting. I told Philip yes. I should tell you about the sentencing, and about something that I know will matter to people who followed this case. At the hearing, Greer made his argument again about Diane's influence over Marcus, and Sandra made her counter-argument, which was that Marcus had been a willing and active participant at every stage, and that the recording alone established both knowledge and intent. Judge Whitfield sentenced Marcus to 15 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction. Diane received 8 years. I know that number is going to feel wrong to a lot of people. It felt wrong to me too at first, but here is what Sandra explained to me afterward. Diane had been careful. Meticulous in the way that people are careful when they have done this before, or when they have studied how not to get caught. Marcus's name was on the forged POA. Marcus's name was on the transfer request. Marcus was the one on camera in my filing cabinet. Diane had kept herself one careful step removed from most of the direct criminal acts, which meant she faced fewer counts, and the evidence against her was less direct. 8 years, Sandra said, was appropriate for what the evidence could prove. More than that, she said, would have been overturned on appeal, and then we would have had nothing. I read that to mean, sometimes the person who lit the fire gets to stand a little further from the smoke. It isn't satisfying. It is how the law works. And I had spent enough years as a witness in courtrooms to know the difference between the justice you want and the justice the system can give you, and to accept the gap without letting it poison what you did get. The victim impact statement was the last time I addressed my son directly. I stood at the podium and I spoke to the room, but I looked at Marcus when I said the parts that were really for him. "I want you to understand something," I said. "When you came to my house after my surgery, I was glad. I thought maybe the distance that had grown between us over the years was finally closing. I made room for you. I trusted you with my home. I trusted you with your mother's garden, which you never once went near, and with the workshop where I taught you the first things you ever learned about building something with your hands. I want you to know that the hardest part of this was not the fraud. It was not the forgery or the legal costs or the months of watching my own son move through my house like a stranger who was there to take inventory. The hardest part was the moment I realized you had looked at everything your mother and I built together and seen only what it was worth to you. That is a grief I will carry for the rest of my life, and no sentence will touch it." I paused. Then I said, "But I want you to also know this. You had every choice available to you. At every step of what you did, there was a door you did not go through. You could have come to me. You could have said you were struggling, that you were scared, that you needed help. I would have listened. That is not a romantic version of our relationship. It is simply true. You chose not to. I have stopped asking myself why, because that question has no answer that will help me live my life, so I am choosing instead to live it." I stepped down from the podium. I did not look at Marcus again. The 6 weeks that followed were quiet in the way that something is quiet when a long, loud thing has finally stopped. I sold the house in Brentwood. I had already made that decision months before, had talked it through with Philip, had known for some time that I did not want to remain in a house that had become, in my mind, The place where a plan to rob me had been made in my own kitchen. I sold it for more than I expected and bought a smaller house in East Nashville, a neighborhood with old trees and neighbors who walked dogs in the evening and a front porch that faced west. The money from the sale, combined with what the estate and cabin had appreciated to over the years, came to a figure that was more than I needed to live on comfortably for the rest of my life. I had already decided what to do with the rest of it. Philip had advised me on the specifics. I established a fund in Carol's name at Vanderbilt Medical Center to support residents from underserved communities who were pursuing cardiothoracic surgery. The field had given me everything. Carol had spent 30 years watching me give it everything I had. It seemed right to put her name on the thing that had defined our life. I set aside a separate amount for a nonprofit in Nashville that provides estate planning services to elderly residents who cannot afford attorneys, which is to say the exact kind of people who are most vulnerable to the exact kind of fraud my son had attempted. Philip drafted the gift agreement. The nonprofit's director called me afterward and was gracious and warm and professional, and I thanked her and hung up the phone and sat for a while at the kitchen table in the new house. Marcus would have been furious if he had known. He had drugged himself on the idea of that money for God knows how long, had let it reshape him into someone who would do what he did, and now it was gone in directions he would never touch, doing things he would never know about. I did not find that poetic. I found it correct. The workshop I built in the garage of the new house took 3 weekends to set up. I brought the tools I had kept through every move, the ones that had been my father's and then mine, and that I had once believed might someday be Marcus's. The chisels and the planes and the draw knife that hung on the pegboard in a row, the way my father had always kept them. The first thing I made in the new workshop was a small box. Nothing complicated, just mortise and tenon joints, a fitted lid, no hardware. I made it the way I had always worked, slowly and carefully, checking the fit at every stage, not moving forward until what I had in my hands was exactly what I had intended. Measure twice, cut once. When the box was finished, I set it on the workbench and looked at it for a while. The joints were tight, the lid fit without play. It was a simple, solid thing. Philip called that evening to check in. He asked how I was adjusting to the new house. I told him I was sleeping better than I had in over a year, which was true. He said he was glad. He paused for a moment and then said, "Harold, in all the years we've worked together, I have never seen anyone approach something this painful with as much patience as you did. I don't know how you held it together." I thought about the workshop, about the years I had spent learning that the way to build something that lasts is not to hurry, not to force the joint, not to skip the steps that feel unnecessary when you are eager to see the finished thing. I told him I had a lot of practice holding things carefully. He asked what I was going to do now. I looked out the window at the oak tree in the yard, where 2 squirrels were conducting a negotiation of some kind on the top branch. A neighbor's kid was riding a bike down the sidewalk. The afternoon was orange and long. "I'm going to be in the workshop," I said, "and I'm going to be on the porch, and I'm going to stop being someone who's waiting for something bad to happen." There was a moment of quiet on his end. Then he said, "That sounds exactly right." I went back to the workshop after I hung up. Put on the old radio, the one that only picks up the classical station clearly, which had always annoyed Carol and which I had kept running for years as a kind of tribute. The light through the garage window was gold and slanted. I picked up a piece of walnut I had been saving since before any of this started, a beautiful piece with a long grain, and I turned it over in my hands and thought about what it wanted to become. Some wood knows what it is before you touch it. You just have to be patient enough to find out. I picked up my marking gauge and I began